This is UpFront Tech. I'm Brian Edwards-Tiekert. Once the internet was a utopia, a new intellectual commons. Then it was a goldmine where massive new businesses would stake their claim and make fortunes unheard of in the history of civilization. For the past couple of years, we've been covering the internet as a swamp, a convening ground for trolls and Nazis, a platform for disinformation and fake news, an impressive tool for fragmenting our national conversation, so we can't even be sure that we and our neighbors are looking at the same world anymore. But before any of that, the internet was a military project, conceived and funded by some of the darker arms of the U.S. Armed Services, designed from its inception not just to enhance military communication in the atomic age, but also to conduct massive surveillance when the theater of war shifted from battlefields to jungle insurgencies. That is the broad arc of our next guest's new book, which traces the internet's military entanglements from its origins straight through to some of the services today that promote themselves as the protectors of privacy. Yasha Levine is an investigative journalist who has spent years covering both the tech industry, its entanglements with the security state, and also post-Soviet Russia. His new book is Surveillance Valley, the secret military history of the internet. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
There's this kind of like common wisdom about how the internet got started, which is that the government wanted a communication system that would still work after a nuclear strike. And that's how it got the idea of a distributed network, where even if most of the nodes get knocked offline, the remaining ones are going to be able to talk to each other. But you trace a different route, which is that the military was also confronting the question of how you fight a guerrilla war, how you fight a counterinsurgency. When the advent of the atomic age meant you didn't have big battlefields anymore. You had these kind of small proxy wars in places like Vietnam. What did surveillance have to do with that?
Well, when you're dealing with an insurgency, right, the biggest problem with that, from a military perspective, is that, well, I mean, short of just wiping everybody out in the whole population of a country or a region where the insurgency is taking place, it's very difficult to find the enemy, because the enemy is part of the civilian population. They're not wearing a uniform. They're not marching in formation. Insurgencies take their strength from coming out of local populations and being completely indistinguishable from them, and getting cover from local populations which are frequently sympathetic to the insurgents' goals. And so there's different ways of dealing with this. You can do a mass terror, campaign where you just terrorize everybody and herd everybody into camps and try to sift things out that happened in Vietnam and in other places. That technique is pretty brutal, and it's been practiced probably for thousands of years, right? But at the time, there was sort of I guess you'd have a slightly more enlightened idea, about how to fight this war. Because computers were just coming online, and computers were just beginning to offer the ability to interact with them in a way that didn't involve having to feed punch cards into them. So America at the time, in the 1950s, began building this thing called SAGE. It was the first early warning radar defense system, designed to protect America from a nuclear attack by air. So if there was, the Soviet Union tested an atomic weapon, and it could deliver that weapon using an airplane, so you had to protect America from this threat. And so this system was created. It showed a possibility, like a proof of concept, is that you could have a computerized system that watched the world in real time and could track things moving, in very complex system of surveillance that could track aircraft moving, that could figure out, based on their velocity and based on their just characteristics of how they're moving, what kind of airplane they are. And you could predict even the future, because it could plot a vector and see where they'll be in half an hour, where they'll be in an hour. So it was this system of surveillance, restricted to airplanes, but out of that came the technology that would allow such a system to even be as a concept, but also the rudimentary elements of a computer workstation that you could feed information into. It would you could take data, it'll show it to an analyst. An analyst can interact with it in a kind of a human manner. And Sage created the first almost computer workstation, because it had a little screen. There are little dots on there. There was even a rudimentary mouse that they called it a light pen, which you touch the screen with, and it opens up menus on the screen. And a lot of people who went on to work on the ARPANET program at ARPA that started in 1962 cut their teeth on this kind of stuff, working on SAGE at MIT. And so the idea is that you could fight this new kind of war, an insurgency, and a global insurgency, with what they saw, by having a better management system that where you could feed data into it about societies, about people, and figure out where is the problem and who is the problem. And then once you isolate the problem, you can neutralize it, just like you would for an enemy airplane.
So the same way NORAD is trying to track the threat of Soviet bombers moving across the North Atlantic, U.S. military forces in Vietnam are trying to surveil the movement of Viet Cong on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yes, I mean, that was an early project of that's kind of halfway between like a NORAD-style system, right, radar system, and something that the internet is today. It's like you are trying to track people. Yes, so they put sensors on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, wireless sensors that would transmit to these antennae that would then transmit to a control center that was powered by IBM computers, and then you could see, if there's like seismic activity, if there's vibrations, that means there are probably trucks moving through the area. They even would have sensors that could detect urine, the smell of urine. So it means that there are troops moving through there peeing, There's these microphones where you could detect if someone's speaking in the jungle, and so that way you could then call in a bombing attack.
And the people who were ginning this up for use in the theater of war in Vietnam were also at the same time specifically contemplating its use dealing with urban unrest in the United States with the riots of the late 1960s and early 70s.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the programs so ARPA was the center of counterinsurgency research in the 1960s. And
explain what ARPA is.
ARPA is the Pentagon R&D wing of the Pentagon. Is a sort of advanced weapons R&D lab run by the Pentagon. We now call it DARPA. And was set up after the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, and it was sort of set up to bridge the technology gap and like the advanced weaponry gap or the missile gap at the time. They thought, because America hadn't yet developed a ballistic missile that could deliver a nuclear warhead, from space. NASA took on a lot of the functions that ARPA was supposed to have. But in the 1960s, after John F. Kennedy came to power, ARPA was transformed into a counterinsurgency agency. So it was trying to develop new ways of fighting this new kind of war, this counterinsurgency war that was happening all around the world. And a lot of the proposals, if you read the proposals for research projects, and at the time, make mention of that, yes, this is good for our efforts in Vietnam, but we can always apply the lessons learned here and the technology developed here to deal with our problems back home. And so ARPA began deploying the ARPANET, which is this decentralized networking technology. In 1969, it was the first node was connected Stanford to UCLA, and then it's quickly expanded nationally. But student activists and anti-war activists were able to obtain proposals for some of the programs associated with ARPANET, and they began protesting it and calling attention to the ARPANET the same year that it was launched. Students for Democratic Society in 1969, they launched this protest. They took over buildings at MIT and at Harvard, and they were protesting what they saw as a surveillance network. They said if ARPANET was allowed to expand nationally and globally, it would create a network of surveillance and a network of social control that the U.S. military would use to dominate the world and to attack and to neutralize left-wing movements in the third world and use it domestically.
So the point where it kind of sees mass adoption is the 1990s, and this is when we start to see commercialization of the internet. I had just always kind of assumed that this was a good technology spreading itself, moving from the universities and elite businesses to popular use because it was getting cheaper, because it was getting more accessible, and because people found it useful. But you point out in the book, it took a deliberate effort by the government to privatize the infrastructure of the internet before mass adoption was possible.
We're talking about ISPs and internet service providers that we use today, like Time Warner, AT&T, Verizon. Their internet divisions actually come out of privatized components of a network that the U.S. government built starting in the 1980s. And it was done by the National Science Foundation, right? So the National Science Foundation was kind of tasked of building a national network that the architecture of it is what the internet looks like today. It has there was a national backbone and smaller regional providers that plugged into it. And it was tasked with building it, funding it, having the federal government fund it, and then when it was commercially viable, to privatize the entire thing. And so that's exactly what it did.
I guess my question is the government's interest at that point in doing this through privatization, is that just about doing favors for well-connected telecom companies, or is that about a belief that if you commercialize, if you privatize, you'll speed up adoption and penetration?
I think it was ideological. Yeah, I think there was definitely a belief that the government can't possibly run this network or manage it. I mean, how could you? I mean, you have to remember this is the Reagan years, and at a time when deregulation and privatization was happening in every sector of society, and the government was seen as something like a dinosaur that was on its way out, and it would be replaced by, private companies, and the private sector was obviously more efficient, obviously better at managing things, obviously better at delivering services to consumers and to people, right? Everybody in the National Science Foundation agreed that privatization was the way to go. Everyone in Congress believed privatization was the way to go. Everyone in the industry, the telecommunications industry that was very much involved in this process, obviously wanted it to be privatized. And Al Gore, who's credited with creating the internet, and he did
credited by himself.
Exactly, and he had a role in it. I mean, he introduced legislation that helped fund some of the networking efforts that were part of the National Science Foundation.
So, the privatization brings with it the emergence of companies that are consumer companies, right? They're not Silicon Valley companies that are only working on government contracts anymore. And so the government, instead of building the tech or contracting with Silicon Valley firms to build the tech they want, starts to play a financier role. It has its own venture capital arms. One that you profile is a CIA-backed investment firm called InQtel.
Yeah. I mean, I'd even like to back up because the government never really got out of the business. DARPA, which, again, DARPA is, we call it DARPA now, but it used to be ARPA. I mean, they just added defense.
The rest of the acronym is Advanced Research
Projects Agency. Yeah, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. It's the Pentagon R&D outfit that created the internet in the 60s. It continued to play a really massive role in underwriting research that would then become some companies. In many cases, like Google, came out of DARPA research. So Google search technology, what they called initially Backrub, it came out of a Stanford research project started by Larry Page. That was financed by DARPA. And so it was a DARPA project, and actually also had funding from the FBI and the National Science Foundation to create digital libraries for the internet, like to find a way of organizing information on the internet, to helping find stuff on the internet, which is chaotic.
What they were calling digital libraries, we would now call a search engine.
Yes, digital libraries. Yeah, exactly. And so, it was just, Google was just one of the search engines that came out of that multi-university research project. Another one was called Lycos. You might remember it from like way back in the day. It was also seeded by DARPA.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I remember when there were multiple competing search engines.
Exactly, and they were all kind of equally crappy.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but the best search engines were the ones that came out of DARPA research because they had some real sort of thinking behind, the engine that drove the relevance engine, right? And so Google, if you read Google's first paper that defines their search algorithm and first kind of outlines their strategy, there's a big thank you note at the bottom saying, thanking DARPA for providing the money to fund this research. And so the government never really got out of the business of funding internet development, and so but there are other entities emerged over time. One of them is InQtel, the CIA venture capitalist, just down the street from Google, actually, in Mountain View, and what they do is they identify startups, small companies that are making products that would be in some way useful to the intelligence community, and so they would have an interest in seeing them succeed, and so they would come in, and they would become part owners of these companies. There would be a capital infusion, and then they would of course help guide the company. They'd have a hand in guiding the development and strategy that these small companies are following, and in the end, those companies could go public or could be bought by other companies, and the CIA would make a tidy profit and then use that money to to finance other companies. A good example of that, that we're talking about Google. A good example of one of these companies is Keyhole. Keyhole was this sort of 3D mapping startup that was eventually purchased by Google and became Google Earth and the Google mapping software that we all use now on all our devices. Keyhole was this small company that was kind of struggling but it created these really cool maps that you could fly through. And so they built a small company that did that, and the In-Q-Tel was like, oh, this is really interesting because we could use this technology for operational purposes. And as soon as In-Q-Tel came in and kind of brought it under the wing of the intelligence community, it was deployed in Iraq. It was being used by armed forces in Iraq to map out, battle plans. Then a year later, Google bought it. And Keyhole had all these contracts with intelligence agencies, with the CIA, with the National Geospatial Agency, which is like the satellite agency. It does satellite intelligence. It had active military contracts. It was a contractor. And Google bought that company and inherited all those contracts. And so then Google became a military contractor that was providing geospatial software, as they call it, geospatial visualization software for the U.S. government. At the same time, Google was also contracted in another way, was selling its search technology to the NSA and to the CIA at the same time. So Google was already also an intelligence and military contractor in the early 2000s. And so, but it just bought this company and it became part of Google, and it has a dual use, obviously. We can use it to map stuff on our phone, but it also has an intelligence and military function.
Yasha Levine, we only have a few minutes left, but there's one part of your book I want to make sure we get to. You did a lot of very original reporting, uncovered documents that have not been in the public anywhere up till this point, showing the government role in spreading technologies that are promoted as protecting the privacy of their users, possibly because what they accomplish is the opposite. Tell me what Tor is and what role the government has played in spreading it and why.
Well, Tor is this thing that people learned about probably most after Edward Snowden came on the scene. And he said that Tor is this amazing anonymity tool that allows you to hide on the internet in plain sight, and allows you to hide from government agencies. It helps prevent anyone from tracking you online, and it guarantees anonymity.
It's short for the Onion Router.
The Onion Router, Tor, yeah.
And it's because it's supposed to hide your internet activity behind layers of anonymization, like the layers of an onion.
Yes, you basically are redirected into this parallel network, and then you're bounced around from node to node to the point where the first node doesn't know what the last node knows. And so it's like a shell game almost, with like little cups and a little ball, like you move this thing around enough times that it just sort of disappears and you don't know where it goes. It's the idea behind the Tor browser. Tor browser also underpins the dark web. It is the dark web. So like dark web marketplaces like the Silk Road and all the other clones that have appeared ever since the Silk Road was taken down, they run on in this cloud, in this sort of shell game cloud. So you can use the Tor browser to go to go to these websites, but you don't actually know where they are physically located. So it disconnects the physical location from an internet address, which you can see the physical location of a server. I mean, where they're located, essentially. And you can see where everything is going, the source and destination of traffic. So it's supposed to guarantee you this protection from the government, from the NSA, from internet service providers and things like that. And it's promoted by Edward Snowden. But as I've sort of reported over the past couple of years, and as I get really specific in my book with new documents that I've uncovered through FOIA, is that the Tor project is a government tool. I mean, it's almost 100% funded by the U.S. government. And it has a couple of different elements of usefulness. On the one hand, it was created by the U.S. Navy to hide its own spies on the internet, so to give spies anonymity. And when you in order to give spies anonymity, you had to open up the whole system to everybody else, so that it wouldn't be just spies using the Onion Router.
Because if there's only 10 people on it, and you know who those 10 people are, you know
who
to direct your surveillance firepower at.
Well, I mean, it's also like if there's this, because you can tell when someone's using the Tor, right? Because it has a certain traffic signature. If it's only, like government agents, logging in from strange locations, then it would be obvious that, okay, this is just the government anonymity system. It's like the government VPN, right? But so in order to hide the government or government's role in it, you have to essentially open it up to everybody, to as wide of a set of users as possible. If you want to have like illegal stuff happening on there, you want to have child porn on there, you want to be selling drugs on there, you want to have hackers use the system that are unaffiliated, let's say, to any kind of state enterprise. You want to have just regular people who are worried about their privacy using it. And so you have just this busy town square. And then when the spy goes into that town square, they kind of hide in the crowd, right? They disappear. And so that's a useful tool for the government. And the government does use this to hide its identity. And in fact, Chelsea Manning, when she was in Iraq, she used Tor as part of her job because her job was basically monitoring extremist websites and extremist forums. And in order to hide the fact that she's in the army, and coming from an army IP address, she used Tor, and then was hung out on those forums and gathered intelligence, right? So it's used by the government for that purpose, and the FBI uses it in its investigations for the same thing. But then there was this other component to it, which is a bit more interesting, which is that the U.S. government also sees it as a tool to prevent countries like China and countries like Russia, increasingly in Iran, from exercising control over their own domestic internet space, right?
So you create this tool to hide the activity of your own spies. To hide them better, you expand it to child porn traffickers and black marketeers and hackers of all stripes. And then to promote your national interests, you also promote it to dissident groups operating in every country that you want to undermine.
Exactly. And so you want to be able to, for people to organize, use Facebook to organize, and use social media platforms to organize political movements. And you want to make, let's say, make it very difficult for Iran to crack down, to stop that organization that's happening online. And so you offer a tool like Tor that hides them from their own government and allows them to organize online, right? And makes control of the internet less effective for those countries. So that's another component that's very useful. And of course, a third component that's complementary is that you convince people who have something to hide, or people who are worried about privacy, or you basically drive them into one tool, and where they self-select themselves as people who worry about maybe potentially doing something online that's illegal, or that's problematic, or that's somehow dangerous. And so it's also a self-selection tool for activists and for journalists, someone who has something to hide.
You mean you take the entire set of people who are using Tor, you subtract out the folks who are your spies or the dissidents that you're supportive of, and the rest are people who might deserve further scrutiny?
Exactly.
That's scary. It's a scary twist to end on. Yasha Levine, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Yasha Levine is an investigative journalist who has spent years covering both the tech industry, its entanglements with the national security state, and also post-Soviet Russia. His new book is Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet. That does it for this edition of UpFront Tech. If you like what you're hearing, help us out. Rate and review us in whatever app you use to listen. It really helps us get the word out. UpFront Tech is produced and hosted by me, Brian Edwards-Tiekert, with help from Lucy Kang. If you just found this, especially if you live in the Bay Area, you might also like the daily show that we produce at KPFA. It's called UpFront, No Tech. We're on live weekday mornings from 7 to 9 a.m. Pacific, streaming at kpfa.org, or over the terrestrial airwaves at 94.1 FM. We also love to hear what you think. Send email to upfront@kpfa.org.